Welcome, everyone, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question-and-answer period. If you would like to ask a question at that time, please press star then 1 on your phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And now I'd like to turn your conference over to Ms. Linda Abrazizi. You may begin, ma'am.
Thank you, and good afternoon for those of you joining on the East Coast, and good morning for those of you joining on the West Coast. Good morning to our speakers in other parts of the world. Thank you for joining us for a webinar on Realities and Benefits of Colombia and Panama Free Trade Agreements webinar. We are pleased to announce that we have over 138 people registered for today's webinar. My name is Linda Abrazizi. I'm an International Trade Specialist for the Trade Information Center for the U.S. Commercial Service of the Department of Commerce. This webinar is being brought to you in cooperation by the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, Caterpillar Latin America, Export-Import Bank, and the Irwin Brown Company. This webinar will provide information about the market opportunities in Colombia and Panama and how to do business there. In a moment, I'll turn this presentation over to Daniel Crocker, who is our Senior Commercial Officer for Panama of the Foreign Commercial Service. Next, who will be speaking is Cameron Worker, who is our Senior Commercial Officer in Colombia, who also is a part of the Foreign Commercial Service. David Carias Jr. of Caterpillar Latin America will then speak, followed by Kate Bishop, who is the Business Development Officer of Export-Import Bank. And lastly, our last speaker is John T. Hyatt, who is the Vice President of Import of the Irwin Brown Company. All speakers will be available at the end of this presentation to answer your questions, and contact information will also be provided. Now, for those of you who just joined, you can still log into this webinar by entering the URL, website, and passcode for instructions that were sent to you by email. And to make sure everyone gets the most benefit from this webinar, you'll be able to hear this presentation via your telephone and view it simultaneously via your computer. So if you are not hooked up to both, please take a moment to do this. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please press star 0 anytime during this presentation. Now, to download the PowerPoint presentation slides from this webinar, there is an icon on the upper right-hand side of your screen. Looks like there are 3 pieces of paper, one overlapping the other. You can put your mouse's cursor over this icon and download the PowerPoint presentation slides from this webinar. During this webinar, we will be taking voice and written questions. To ask a voice question, please press star 1, and if you would like to ask a written question, there's an icon on your upper left-hand side with the letters Q&A, and if you put your mouse's cursor on that icon, you can type in your question anytime during this presentation. What we will do is we will compile these questions and present them as many as time allows during this presentation. And if there are any questions which we are not able to answer during this webinar, due to time constraints, we will try to get back to you via an email. Now, I'd like to introduce live online our Senior Commercial Officer of the Foreign Commercial Service, Daniel Crocker. Thank you, Daniel.
Linda, thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Just to put my remarks in context, and I'll try to be brief so that there's time for Q&A. I've been in Panama for just over a couple of years, and I'm coming from some other Latin American posts, most notably Mexico and Brazil, which are both much larger markets. But Panama is remarkable in a couple of ways, so let's go right into it. So the important thing to know about Panama, and it really comes down to this and has been for 500 years in history, is the location. It's all about just what your real estate agent's always told you. It's location, location, location. So if you look at Panama from the sort of a straight stats play, you say, okay, there's a population of 3.5 million. That's a really small country. And but then you start looking into the GDP stats, and you actually see some numbers that are pretty revealing. From a purchasing power parity point of view, it's a $40 billion economy, and that's grown 11% in the last year, so it's really high growth. But when you look at the breakdown, that's when things start getting interesting, and it tells you that Panama is not like another Central American country. Not at all, because if you look at the services sector, that's contributing 80% of that GDP. So what that tells you right away is that Panama is a service-oriented economy. It does not manufacture much of anything, so even though there's a small market, a trading and service-oriented economy tends to have low barriers to entry, tends to be very pragmatic with regards to U.S. goods and services, and tends to be an attractive market for a variety of reasons. And if you look at that, that's borne out in the statistics for U.S. exports alone. So we're looking at a 34% jump from 2000 2010 to 2011, and over $8 billion of U.S. exports last year to Panama. That represents over 30% market share of all Panama's imports. And remember what I said, Panama doesn't make anything. Maybe they make some beer, maybe they make some milk, but pretty much everything else is going to be imported, and the significant percentage of that is imported from the United States. What does that mean for you as an U.S. exporter? It means there's already a high level of acceptance for U.S. goods and services. Ideologically, culturally, the environment's set for you for new entry. So what are Panama's advantages? And I'll sort of offline, I'll touch upon a couple of the disadvantages, but primarily it's all glory for U.S. exporters, not so much for investors, but exporters. First of all, right off the top is the exposure that Panama is getting because of the recently ratified free trade agreement with the United States. And we'll touch upon that a little more separately. But that's a big play for Panama. It's a big advantage for you in terms of competitive advantages, in terms of duties. But the important thing is, if you look at the Panama's real advantages, it's a logistics hub for the region. It's a logistics hub for the Americas. And it's certainly the Panama Canal is a century-old and operating quite well, and the expansion plans are well underway, and they're going to happen, and it's going to make it even more important in terms of global and regional commerce. But there are also other things. For instance, it's a dollarized economy. Now, when I say dollarized, I don't mean they have a peso or a bolivar that's literally pegged at a dollar, and maybe they'll fight to defend it under crushing debt, and maybe they won't. What I mean is they have no central bank. They don't print paper money. So if you're paying people in transactions, or more importantly, as a U.S. exporter, if you're getting paid in cold, hard American cash. And that means a lot. If you think about it, it simplifies all kinds of business planning. If you have a commission basis for your rep or agent down here, you don't have to hedge against foreign exchange risk. You can offer terms to your U.S. exporters using Ex-Im Bank credit insurance against a basket of receivables and not worry about hedging against foreign exchange risk. All kinds of nice things happen. But it also means that stability of the political and economic environment is there, which is really unique almost in Latin America. Latin America, you've had periods of hyperinflation characterized by times of deflation and stability. In Panama, because there's no central bank, they can't inflate their way out of debt. They can't inflate their way out of debt. And what that actually means is that they're inherently more conservative about getting into debt in the first place. So we see some of the lowest historical rates of inflation of anywhere in the hemisphere. As I mentioned, a very stable economic and political environment, but that's also in no small part due to the fact that the U.S. government presence, and particularly military presence, has up till a couple of decades ago been very strong in the region. We've seen this area as a strategic asset, and we've certainly worked very closely and continue to work very closely in Panama to make it as safe as it is. I would assert at this point, having lived in Brazil and Mexico, and especially Northeast Mexico, I would assert that Panama City is perhaps the safest city in Latin America, the safest capital city, that is. And that means a lot for you doing business here. It means a lot for you being able to retain reps and agents and distributors, and more importantly, the secondary consequences of having people invest in Panama and create more economic growth, which results in opportunities for you. Now, the sophisticated banking sector goes without saying because of the services, because of the global logistics. So let's move on and take a look at what you should look at when you talk about Panama. Now, for a good number of companies, remember I said there's over $8 billion in U.S. exports to Panama. Panama is a good market in and of its own right. Small market, low barriers to entry, so why not? Easy to get to. But when it gets really interesting is what David Carius for Caterpillar is going to talk about a little bit later, and that is thinking of Panama creatively as a regional play. Let me give you an example. For instance, the air hub for Panama, Copa Airlines, just bought almost $2 billion in Boeing jets last year. And that is not to fly 3.5 million Panamanians around. It's because Panama is becoming a regional air hub. And so you get all kinds of air cargo logistics. You get multinational settling here with regional headquarters because they're nonstop to a whole bunch of points throughout Latin America. You get all kinds of airport growth opportunities. And, of course, all the logistics of things you would move by ocean-bound freight are continuing to increase because of the expansion of the canal. Now, just a word on that expansion. I don't want to get into it. We can do it in Q&A. But the bottom line is this. In 2 or 3 years, you're going to be able to see boats that can carry 5,000 20-foot equivalent units passing through the canal. That's going to grow to about 12,000 20-foot equivalent units. In other words, over doubling the capacity of boats and tankers that can move through the Panama Canal. And that has a ripple effect on ports. So if you're into ports and supportive logistics for ports in the United States, this is something you're almost certainly already watching. Now, the other thing that's interesting in terms of Panama's investment scheme is that in public investment alone, there's over $13 billion worth of projects. And a lot of that is predicated on the fact that Panama sees itself as a very attractive place to do global regional logistics and attract multinational headquarters for a regional play. So those are the kinds of things that you'd most want to capitalize on. Now, what I want to touch upon next is the free trade agreement and why it matters to you. And you're going to hear this echoed by my colleague Cameron in Bogota. But the bottom line, hands down, advantage for you is your margin and winning the business. Look, I worked for a Tier 1 automotive and railroad supplier for a few years in Richmond. And I'll tell you something, this kind of margin to drop from 10 to 15% to zero as a competitive advantage over South Korean tapered roller bearing manufacturers, that meant a lot to us. So that kind of thing, you're going to hear that echoed by Caterpillar, I think, in terms of their FTA growth. But basically, this is the big, fat advantage for U.S. exporters. This is a big win for us. It's a competitive advantage over European, Chinese, South Korean exporters that you're competing against for the business here in Panama. It's also, we think it may help with Government of Panama sales. Now, it's usually sunshine and glory for U.S. exporters to Panama, with the one caveat that outside of the Panama Canal Authority's procurement of, let's say, $250 million a year in ongoing operations, selling to the rest of the Government of Panama has been a little bit tricky. It's not so transparent. So we're actually hoping there are parts of the agreement which touch upon that, and we're actually hoping that that'll give us more teeth, more of a trade enforcement capacity to go after those procurements where you don't feel like you're getting a fair deal. It's also a political statement, and that carries dividends as well. In terms of bilateral relations, it furthers the bilateral relations. That makes people more inclined to view the United States favorably. That actually, it really does translate into things, and we see a huge growth in franchise opportunities, for instance, as a result of that. People like going to the American franchises. They feel well-disposed. They say, we've got a good relationship with this country, and that matters. And then finally, it's like that good housekeeping seal of approval. It's a good housekeeping seal of approval that means Brazilian companies might relocate regional headquarters here. Well, what does that mean to you? Well, again, as a secondary consequence, that might mean that there are all kinds of follow-on export opportunities for services and the like, infrastructure opportunities. So those kinds of things are the kinds of things that we would expect to see with more regional headquarters operating here. So what are your next steps? Well, it's pretty simple. First, we've done a lot of content. We've put a lot of content on export.gov/Panama, a lot of content. We strongly suggest that you take 10 or 15 minutes, surf through some of the stuff we put there, particularly our Doing Business in Panama guide. That's your first step because it's easy and it takes you 10 to 15 minutes. Second, if you like what you see, work with one of our U.S. Exports Assistance Centers, and you can type in your zip code and find it within 2 clicks. And then third, if you want to pick up the phone or send us an email, we'd be glad to talk to you about specific opportunities. The devil's inevitably in the details, so in the end, what you're going to want to do is talk to a real-life person, and we're there to help you out. Thanks very much.
Cameron Worker from Colombia will follow, our Senior Commercial Officer.
Okay, hello everybody on the phone. This is Cameron Worker coming live from sunny Bogota. It's a beautiful day down here. Thank Dan for a great presentation on Panama. As you know, I'll be talking about Colombia now. And if you thought Dan spoke fast, hold on tight, because I speak probably a little bit faster than Dan does. But I got a number of slides, so I'm going to launch right into it. I think that more than anything, right, today Colombia suffers more from perceptions of the past than it does the realities of the present. Colombia is not the narco state that people think it was back in the days of Pablo Escobar, the problems in the 80s and 90s. Certainly still have internal problems, internal conflicts, but the last 10 years have seen a revolutionary change within Colombia, and I'm going to talk about that. But first, just at a glance, Colombia is actually the 3rd largest market in all of Latin America after Brazil and Mexico. And as Dan talked about, location. Colombia is also equally prime. We actually border Panama. But more importantly, internally, Colombia has 5 bona fide business hubs. If you think about some other markets in Latin America, again, outside of Brazil and Mexico, Peru, one city, Argentina, maybe two, Chile, one. We have five, Bogota, Barranquilla, Cartagena, Cali, and Medellin, all with over 1 million population. In fact, there are over 40 cities in Colombia that have over 100,000 people. So the market opportunities for your products and services are vast and not concentrated in one single city. What we've seen recently in Colombia is an explosion of foreign direct investment, which has spurred gross domestic product growth. 2011, we saw 5.5% GDP growth. Of course, if you talk to an accountant or an economist or anybody, you get 100 different stories, but most agree that Colombia will continue to experience between the 5 and 6% growth rate for the years to come, certainly in 2012. The big driver of that growth is the fact that in the 80s and 90s and previously, Colombia had a lot of problems. And so they were almost a closed-off society, closed-off economy. And over the last 10 years, with a dedicated focus to improving the safety and security situation in the country, they have opened it up to foreign investors, to international business. In a minute, I'll show you a slide with all their free trade agreements. Of course, they have one that we're waiting to be implemented with the United States. So a tremendous amount of growth. Again, if you look at what we had in the 90s, you can see the slide on the left. I'm not going to read it. But today, the economic liberalization is key. Foreign direct investment reached $13 billion in 2011. 80% of that in the oil and gas industry. I can assure you, unless you're in the oil and gas industry or the mining industry, that you will not be operating in portions of Colombia that are that dangerous. So if you got 80% of $13 billion, which is about $10 billion pumped into some of the most dangerous areas in Colombia, imagine what the opportunities are in the safe havens of the cities and the populated areas. We've seen increased transparency, increased judicial reform, increased corporate social responsibility by multinational and Colombian players, and again stressing the improved security situation. That's not to say that everything is rosy. Still, we have a large informal economy in Colombia. Of course, just about anywhere, whether you're in Washington, D.C. or Paris or Bogota, there's going to be a certain amount of bureaucratic red tape that you have to deal with. Obviously, no different here. But at the end of the day, you do actually have a very sophisticated market. And if you take anything away from this 10 minutes, is the fact that you have a huge competitive advantage in Colombia. And that competitive advantage is the fact that Colombians like to do business with Americans. They prefer, and in some cases demand, American products. Again, this is a direct result of all the U.S. military intervention and assistance during the 80s and 90s. $7 billion over 10 years in U.S. government military assistance to Colombia. Certainly the government appreciates U.S. military hardware, but what happened is that the consuming public of Colombia saw the benefits that the U.S. military brought to its country, and they extrapolated that to equate to quality consumer products and services. So it's not a stretch to say that Colombian consumers, public and private, do prefer to buy American. You can't have a greater competitive advantage. In fact, the only country in the world I can think where that also occurs is Albania. And Colombia is a much better market than Albania. I mentioned that I was going to demonstrate how liberal the market here in Colombia has become. This is a list of some of the free trade agreements that Colombia has already implemented, ratified, or has pending ratification. They have free trade agreements with almost everybody in Latin America, including Canada, implemented as of August of last year. They have free trade agreements that are negotiating with the European Union, and of course we're waiting on implementation of the free trade agreement with the United States, which right now is in a very technical phase, but most people are optimistic that this can get done by the end of the summer of this year. So again, we have to wait and see. It's very technical. It's not political anymore. We have to see how Colombia progresses and some of the things the U.S. government requires of its bilateral trade partners. But again, just an indication of how open Colombia has become to the outside world and as a trading partner to the world. The FTA, which I know is on the minds of a lot of people, is not a cure-all, but it will certainly open up huge opportunities for U.S. exporters of products and services. The services industry here is a staggering $166 billion market. Again, largely driven by oil and gas, but it crosses the spectrum of industries. U.S. goods that are coming in, upon implementation, immediately 80% of U.S. products will enter into Colombia duty-free. So I'm not going to reiterate what Dan said about what an incredible advantage that is to your customers, especially if you're selling input material that Colombian customers then further manufacture into a finished good. As Dan's statistics show, that immediately makes you between 10 and 14%, whatever the tariff might be, makes them more competitive against their competitors. So if you are a U.S. textile manufacturer and you're exporting your products to Colombian garment manufacturers and they're competing against Indian or Chinese garment manufacturers, you've just made them that much more competitive. So it's a huge, huge advantage for U.S. exporters. It will liberalize the services industry. It will discontinue the national treatment that Colombian firms get over U.S. firms. This will basically put U.S. firms on equal footing as if they were a Colombian firm. So again, huge advantages in that sector. Again, a couple specific examples. The auto industry, which is a huge market, auto parts industry, a huge market here in Colombia for U.S. exporters, has an average tariff of 17.4%. Depending on the specific HTS code of the part, it can go down to 0 if it's in a Category A, or would be phased in over a number of years. But regardless, immediately making those products more competitive. Again, my time is getting short, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see the slide. Again, these are some of the best prospects that we see in Colombia. In addition to the services industry, construction is huge. I mentioned $13 billion in foreign direct investment in Colombia in 2011. A lot of construction because there are a lot of infrastructure projects to be bid on in Colombia. In fact, the Colombian government has allocated $26 billion over the next 4 years for infrastructure projects. That doesn't even account for private investment or public-private partnerships. That's $26 billion right off the top for roads, rail, airports, and ports. In addition to infrastructure, leading sectors for U.S. exporters, as you can see on the slide, again, anything regarding construction, equipment, products, aircraft, parts, fertilizers, etc. We have 13 best prospects in Colombia for U.S. exporters that you can read about in our country commercial guide on the www.export.gov website. Lastly, just a couple general tips. I'm not here to necessarily sell you on Colombia. It may sound like I am. Really what I'm trying to do is open everybody's eyes to what the realities in Colombia are, what the opportunities are. You will need to make a decision on your own if it fits your business strategy to investigate Colombia as a potential export destination. But just like in any market, Colombia is no different. Prepare yourself. I mentioned the country commercial guide. It's readily available for free to U.S. companies on the www.export.gov website. The one thing that it might be a little bit different in Colombia is that we do have the Office of Foreign Asset Controls here, and there's something that is affectionately known as the Clinton list. These are companies or individuals who have been determined to be involved in laundering of drug money. You definitely want to make sure you check this list. There's a link to it on our Commercial Service Bogota website. You can search names of people, names of organizations, because they have been completely blacklisted from U.S. financial institutions as well as Colombian banking institutions. Pretty much persona non grata in terms of doing legitimate business. Always want to do due diligence on your partner or large customers. I would also recommend using arbitration as mediation as a first line of defense for dispute resolution. Colombia is not different than anywhere else. The last thing you want to do is find yourself in a court, least of all in Colombia. So I would highly recommend using those two mechanisms first and foremost before going to court, and always get legal advice. Spanish is the language here. I'm not going to go through this because I know I'm very short on time. And lastly, this website here is hit or miss, but what it will do is if you put in your HTS number for an export to Colombia, it will tell you if your product goes to zero immediately or if there is a phase-in period. This is very useful for planning and also very useful for your customers as they're the ones most likely paying the import duty. I'm going to stop there, and I want to thank everybody for their time and attention, and I will pass it off to the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to our next speaker, who's David Curious of Caterpillar Latin America. David?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Special thanks to Dan Crocker and his commercial team for inviting me to come speak with each of you today about what we as Caterpillar really see as a great opportunity to improve lives of individuals around the world, but also to improve, obviously, from our perspective, business by focusing on free trade agreements. Without both of these commercial teams, our counterparts down there in Colombia, as well as the guys here in Dan's group, the American and U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other organizations like the Latin American Trade Coalition and Business Roundtable, these FTAs, which are so highly, highly critical to Caterpillar, would never have happened. So to each of you on the phone who's been involved in the passage of these free trade agreements, thank you very much. From our perspective, there are a number of realities that we have to deal with when it comes to free trade agreements. So what I'm really going to try and do for you right now over the next couple of minutes is to give you an idea as to how we view FTAs at a 30,000-foot level. From there, what we'll do then is we'll discuss, I guess, more details about Panama and Colombian territories. The U.S. currently, as many of you are aware, has FTAs that run down the west coast of Latin America, obviously with the exception of Ecuador. They're extremely important from our perspective for Caterpillar, as exports have increased substantially in recent history. Just to give you an example, in 2010, Caterpillar exports increased by 58%. Now, that's more than any other region of the world. It's also important to keep in mind that 6 of the 10 largest export markets for our organization, for Caterpillar, are in Latin America, and Colombia being one of those. Getting a bit more specific, we saw drastic increases in exports to these countries following their approval of the free trade agreements. Since the FTAs have gone into effect, just to give you some examples, Caterpillar exports are up about 5-fold in Mexico, about 3-fold in Chile, and up more than 60% in Peru. So again, from our perspective, free trade is absolutely imperative to doing business and to creating a competitive environment where we can all fairly compete with all of our competitors. Just to give you an example, South Korea passed an FTA prior to our FTA. From our perspective, without our own free trade agreement, the Korean manufacturers, just to give you 2 examples, Hyundai and Doosan, they would have had a significant competitive advantage over Caterpillar and other American-made products. So this fact alone makes the passage of the FTA with Colombia all the more important. Ultimately, the FTAs that we're seeing will both allow us to compete fairly, but it will obviously also support improved living standards for all involved, as well as support our clients. Let's just take, for example, if you look in the top right corner of my slide, that's a 777. That's a 100-ton truck that we manufacture in Decatur, Illinois. Now, our clients, because of the tariffs, they're paying about 10% on that product. That means that they're paying around $130,000 to $140,000 in duties for each truck they purchase. Now, we have a number of these products running around the Panama Canal. Those clients of ours who have put their trust in Caterpillar to purchase our products are paying $130,000 to $140,000 in duties. With this free trade agreement, that goes away. So from our perspective, our clients can take that money and that capital and they can invest it in other things. Now, at the end of the day, as we all know, free trade agreements are great for us, but they're also great for other manufacturers in the U.S. So we do expect, and many in the product support side of the business as well as the machinery side of the business, we do expect to see competition increase. But again, I'll say it before and I'll say it again, that's a good thing. Competition is good for us, and it's good for, again, our clients. Both Panama and Colombia are very friendly markets for Caterpillar and many other companies. They both have, as you guys saw from Cameron and from Dan, they both have solid GDP growth, stable interest rates, and have overall friendly business and political environments in which to operate. So increasing trade with both Colombia and Panama is extremely important for our organization. Now, getting into a couple more details, or a little more details about Panama specifically. It's home to our dealer, YASA, which has just recently taken over. They've been here a little less than a year now, but they were our dealer in Ecuador for 90 years. So they're still currently our dealer in Ecuador, and now they're able to sell Caterpillar products in Panama. They have been and continue to prepare themselves because with every FTA comes changes. So they're preparing themselves as we speak. When we talk about the free trade agreement, though, in the context of Panama, I just want to make it very clear, and Dan alluded to this earlier, we're not just talking about Panama market and the importance of that market specifically. What I'm doing is I'm talking about a market that many consider the crossroads of the world. That being the case, what we're doing in Panama affects our business in many other parts of the world as well. So beyond the dealer that we have here in Panama, they employ about 400 individuals. Beyond that dealer, YASA, Caterpillar, we are investing in significant amounts of capital in the country. We've established a new and used equipment facility here in Panama, and that equipment facility serves as a staging ground, if you want to call it that, and supplies many regions of the world with equipment. Many of you are aware that we're constructing a customer demonstration and learning center here in Panama as well that will support our clients in various training requirements throughout the entire region. And lest we forget that we, Caterpillar Latin America, we have about 300 Caterpillar employees operating here in Panama as well. Now those 300 employees are representing 10 different Caterpillar business units, both commercial business units as well as back office personnel. So hopefully it's obvious that the FTA with Panama is highly critical, and as we attempt to ensure our investments here benefit our clients, the local market, our dealers, and the overall Caterpillar organization. As we're all aware, and I believe, Cameron, you alluded to this before with the construction investments in Colombia, one of the more onerous trade barriers, and again, we're probably all aware, is a lack of infrastructure. This is something else that really makes Panama attractive as a country. They have an infrastructure that includes the Panama Canal Railway, port facilities, both at the Pacific and the Atlantic sides. Beyond this, they have continued investment in infrastructure. That is absolutely critical to any FTA, is continued investment in infrastructure. Panama is currently investing in the expansion of the canal, the Panama Canal. They have new metro systems under construction, various highway construction projects, etc. So they continue to invest in their infrastructure, which again will help make any FTA effective. Now, it's not widely known, but in 2010, Caterpillar exported more products to Panama than we did to South Korea. So again, this makes Panama that much more critical. So we talked a little bit about Colombia, we talked a little bit about Panama, and now we'll talk a little bit about Colombia. That is home to our largest dealer in the Caribbean, Central America, and the northern part of South America. They currently have about 4,500 employees working for them, and they've been in existence since 1927. Now, as I mentioned a couple of times, without solid transportation infrastructures in place, FTAs won't have much of an immediate effect because if you can't get your products to market, the magnitude of tariffs, that doesn't even matter. So this is very much a positive, again, when examining Colombia. They have been investing billions of dollars in infrastructure, as Cameron spoke to earlier, development over the past couple of years, and they continue to do so in 2012, and we expect it to continue next year as well. Commodity prices at their current level are benefiting Colombia. They have extensive mining operations. Just to give you an example, in the top right of my slide, again, you see a picture there. That's a D11. A D11 is the largest tractor we make, and in front of it is a little skid steer loader. We have 100 D11s operating in the same mine site in Colombia. Now, that's the highest population on any one site in the world for Caterpillar. So beyond the extensive investments taking place by the government of Colombia, we as Caterpillar, like Panama, are also investing in the future of Colombia. We've just established a Cat Financial operation there within the country that will help us support and better serve our clients there. And like I did to Panama, if you want to compare Caterpillar exports to those of other countries around the world, in 2010, Caterpillar exported more products to Colombia than we did to India or Germany. Now, again, this is very, very significant because we all understand the size of the markets in India as well as in Germany. So if you take everything that I've talked about here over the past couple of minutes, I'll just try and summarize it and package it up for you. From our perspective, again, FTAs are absolutely critical to the local markets we serve and to the success of our clients and organization. From our perspective, if you look at what they do, they foster competitive work environments for all involved, and they ensure fair play, strengthen protection and enforcement of trademarks, things like patents intellectual property, dispute settlements, etc. But beyond that, they foster increased transparency and ultimately accountability, all good for business. So these FTAs, however, in order to be effective, we need, number one, Class A infrastructure. We need continued investment in infrastructures. And we need rapid implementation of the complete and critical free trade agreements. Let's say they generally take 12 to 18 months. From our perspective, we need to move very, very quickly to implement these free trade agreements so that we can compete with our competitors in places like South Korea or China or wherever they may come from. But again, thank you to everybody who was involved in the free trade agreements. We greatly appreciate it, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you, David. And now we'll go to our next speaker, Kate Bishop, the Business Development Officer of the Export-Import Bank.
Good afternoon. Am I on? Yes. Okay. Now that you've heard from our Department of Commerce colleagues in the two relevant countries and seen a real world, or heard a real world example from Caterpillar, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the financial piece and what the government offers in the way of financial support. Just to give you a little bit of background, Export-Import Bank is the official export credit agency, or ECA, of the U.S. government. Basically, any country that engages in trade to a significant degree or even to an insignificant degree has an export credit agency. We've been around since 1934. We were established in the midst of the Great Depression. We're headquartered here in Washington, D.C., and we have 8 regional offices, and they are in the 5 states with the largest amount of export activity. So Florida, Texas, California, Illinois, and New York. Our mission is to both create and sustain jobs here in the United States by substantially increasing the number of companies we serve and expanding their access to global markets. We offer the range of financing products from pre-export financing, which is where our working capital guarantee fits in, to post-export financing, where we categorize insurance, guarantees, and direct loans that we offer. And I'd like to give you a brief introduction to each of our core products. The first one, pre-export financing, this is a working capital guarantee, and it's basically directed to SMEs. It's a 90% conditional guarantee to lenders for export-related working capital loans. Typically, banks have a country limit, and with our support, they can lend against foreign receivables as well as domestic receivables and thereby expand the borrowing base of the exporter. These loans can be transaction-specific or revolving, and we have no minimum or maximum. Next, our most popular product is export credit insurance, or short-term accounts receivable insurance. This is an insurance policy, as you might understand, typically goes out 6 months, in exceptional cases a year. It covers both commercial and political risk. It does not, however, cover disputes between buyers and sellers. So if there's a misunderstanding over red versus white wine, for example, this would not be covered. We have both lender and exporter policies under this product. For the lender policies, we cover bank LCs, and we also offer something called a financial institution buyer credit. This is typically directed towards bulk agricultural exports. On the exporter side, we have multi-buyer or single buyer, also a portion of the buyers that can be covered. If you have issues or questions with a single buyer, you can buy a policy just for that buyer, or you can cover all of your buyers and get a much better rate from us. Next, we have medium-term financing. This is where a lot of the Caterpillar equipment fits in. This is typically used to finance capital equipment. It requires 15% down and can be financed up to 85% of the U.S. portion, which I'll get into in a moment. Typical repayment term is 5 years, exceptionally 7. Here we're talking about $10 million or less. And we have both insurance and loan guarantees in this category. This is also where we finance foreign buyers who wish to purchase U.S. equipment. Our long-term financing is where the big Boeing jets that were mentioned are covered, and also where we do project finance in various sectors. This is a longer repayment term, over 5 years, and $10 million or more in dollar value. Again, it requires a 15% down, and we can finance up to 85% of the U.S. content. We do not offer a long-term insurance policy, unlike some of our other ECA counterparts. We do, however, offer mostly loan guarantees and, in a few cases, direct loans. We do have special initiatives, a green initiative where you can have longer terms and also finance the interest portion of the equipment if it's environmentally beneficial. We have a medical equipment initiative, and we have something called a TSEP, which we established after September 11, 2001, that gives favorable terms to baggage and cargo screening equipment at airports, for example. Because we kind of cover both ends of the spectrum, we cover the big Boeing 747s and the like, but we also have a special outreach for small business, and as a matter of fact have a 20% congressional mandate for small business coverage. And by small business for a manufacturer, we're talking about 500 or fewer employees in accordance with SBA's definition. We do have a few restrictions because we are a government agency, but I'd like to point out at this moment that we are completely self-sufficient and have returned money to the Treasury for the past 5 years. We cannot finance military exports or military end users except in rare instances. As I mentioned, we have foreign content restrictions. For a small business, as long as there's only 15% foreign content, we can cover the entire transaction. But for larger businesses, we can only cover the U.S. content portion once you go past the 15%. We have a few restricted countries, although we're open in every continent. You can check our CLS, or country limitation schedule, for the updates. The countries you might imagine that are off cover include Syria, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and the like. For the larger transactions, we also do economic impact analysis to make sure we do no harm to domestic industry. We have to ship on U.S. flag vessels for our direct loans and for transactions exceeding a certain size limit. And we must provide additionality. What I mean by this is that if the private sector can do the transaction, we want them to do it. We're not here to compete with private sector. We want to enhance what they do. I wanted to just touch on the two markets very briefly in terms of our activity there. As indicated, Colombia is not the old Colombia that you remember. It's rebounding from years of violence. There's much improved domestic security, and they are implementing very pro-market economic policies. The internal development plan calls for billions of dollars in infrastructure, and we have 5 highlighted sectors from the government: ag, extractive industries, infrastructure, housing, and innovation. As mentioned also, the FTA is expected to increase U.S. trade and create more U.S. jobs. Over 80% become duty-free immediately, and the other tariffs are phased out over the next decade. In terms of Exim Bank exposure, we started from a relatively low base in 2009, and now they are, this slide is a little bit out of date, they're our second largest market in Latin America after Mexico. The projected exposure total is $3.7 billion, which makes Ecopetrol, the national oil and gas company in Colombia, one of our single largest exposures. To get drilled down on this a little bit, we offered a $1 billion preliminary commitment to Ecopetrol. This was then converted into a final commitment split between medium-term and long-term loan guarantees. We also recently approved a $2.84 billion direct loan guarantee combination to Reficar, which is a subsidiary of Ecopetrol. So we're very bullish on Colombia. In terms of Panama, you've already heard how fast the economy is growing. The GDP growth rate was over 9% and is projected to grow over 6%. I think we've already exceeded that in the next couple of years. The demand for high-end U.S. products and services is very high, and as mentioned, it is a dollar-based economy, which makes it very easy to do business. Again, the FTA will support U.S. jobs and enhance our competitiveness vis-a-vis our foreign country competitors. The current average tariff is around 7%. Some go up as high, however, as 81%. And in terms of ag, some in very sensitive areas are 260%. But again, these are all due to be phased out over 80% immediately, with the remaining over the following decade. Here is our contact information. I have other business development officers together with my colleague Xiomara Crocker. I handle the Americas, Europe, and the Caribbean. We also have global business development officers for the other regions and a dedicated officer for medical technology. Here is our telephone contact information. I wanted to last put in a plug for our annual conference. It's being held here in Washington, April 12th and 13th. We heard on Friday that Bill Clinton will be our keynote speaker, so I encourage you all to come. If you want information, you can log on to our website, exim.gov, or contact the conference organizer, Nikki Shepard. And the syntax of the Global Business Development Division is firstname.lastname@exim.gov. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. And now we'll go to our last presenter, John Hyatt, Vice President Import of the Irwin Brown Company.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's John Hyatt from New Orleans. It's the day after Mardi Gras, so we're all trying to recover. Some of these slides I'm going to pass through very quickly because they have been covered by Dan and Cameron and also Kate to some extent, but I want to get to the meat of some of these items which are important. These agreements, as you know, were signed. It looks like Korea, for instance, it will be coming on board March 15th. We're still looking for some input as far as the negotiations with Colombia and Panama, but we feel by the first quarter of this year they will all be in place. Very quickly, some of the background you can see here. This is some information that was previously shared with the other presenters. Again, what I want to point out is Panama has significant mineral reserves. They're developing a large copper mine right now with one of the largest deposits in the world. This provides excellent opportunities for U.S. exporters of mining equipment and machinery. Additionally, there's a subway project that was mentioned earlier, which began last year, and it could result in substantial possibilities for exporters of anything involved in, again, subway production machinery, that sort of thing. Ongoing enlargement of the Panama Canal locks, again, it's going to result in reduced duties and importation of all sorts of machinery. These free trade zones, the Cologne zone and the new zone being completed on the other side, the former Howard Air Force Base, are going to position Panama significantly to be a platform for moving major consumer goods for the big box retailers, where it will be an intermediate stop incorporating U.S. inputs to basically go from one hemisphere to the other as quickly as possible, depending upon what markets are emerging. Trading consumer goods has recovered significantly since the economic meltdown, and if you just look at some stats from 2010, the top U.S. importers of consumer goods, moved over 2.8 million TEUs, as seen from this listing, starting with Walmart going down to Whirlpool. So it's a significant sector of the economy. U.S. exports to Colombia, again, are large. Colombia is the largest importer of grains. They also handle a lot of cotton, yarn, and fabric for the apparel industry. And I'd like to say, paraphrase F. Ross Johnson in Barbarians at the Gate, every penny sent down comes back dressed up as a nickel. It's always important to remember. These are some of the key export sectors that were mentioned previously by both Daniel and Cameron as significant opportunities in Panama and Colombia. Again, half of current U.S. farm exports to Colombia will become duty-free, as with these listings of the various commodities. But again, the protracted delay in the approval of the agreements has meant there was some sliding back. We've lost 60% of the soybean market, 50% of the wheat market because of other agreements that have been signed. Canada and Colombia went into a free trade agreement recently in August, where flour millers in Colombia will switch to Canadian grain because of a more favorable price. And of course, there's competition between Bombardier of Canada and Boeing. So with the trade agreement in place, that would make us more competitive. Although 85% of the imports to the U.S. From both countries enter duty-free, there are protected categories, but with the FTA allowing textiles and wearing apparel, footwear, and flat goods to have incorporated into them U.S. inputs and come in duty-free, that allows for a lot more exports going down. Agricultural products are duty-free coming into the United States anyway, but there are a number of different tropicals that can be marketed just as successfully as mango and papaya by a number of different methods, joint marketing, point of sales demonstrations, supermarket promotions, and because of the fact that the U.S. consumer likes very nice looking fruit, consistent size, symmetry, color, the opportunity for the U.S. producers to send in fertilizers and agrochemicals that give both Panama and Colombia the wherewithal for successful sales in the U.S. is very important. These trade agreements encourage production sharing, which is important. These countries earn foreign exchange, and in exchange they can go ahead and buy U.S. exports. That's always important to remember. Many developing countries don't have the infrastructural capacity to participate in trade, but these trade agreements do build that capacity. That's important to remember. The textile and apparel sector as an engine of growth is usually the first step toward industrialization with many of these countries. And in the old agreements that we had with the Caribbean Basin, et cetera, most of what was handled down in the region were what they call commodity items, little fashion applied to them, that sort of thing. But this is a significant part of the industry. Nearly 400,000 people of the entire workforce are in these jobs, and they're higher paying jobs, which give them basically income to buy U.S. produced consumer goods. Also important. The U.S. consumer industry going into lean retailing makes the Caribbean, Central America, particularly Panama and Colombia, a lot more attractive to get very quick response and put product on the shelves as quickly as possible. Again, using inputs from the United States to essentially come in on a duty-free reduced basis. Most retailers are looking for a full package in the apparel industry, so the suppliers have to provide all the input. And again, because of trends in the Far East and in Asia, it makes the Caribbean, Central America, Panama, Colombia more attractive, particularly with Chinese producers that are more interested in focusing on internal demand. Shipping rates are higher. India and Pakistan are forcing manufacturers to meet local demand. That export or link production is lessening for U.S. Equally, Asian manufacturers are starting to come into Central America and set up full package operations, which will only benefit U.S. Producers of the inputs in the long run because we're the quickest ones to respond for the marketplace. Equally so with Europe, there's a free trade agreement in place that was signed in May of 2011, which should bring in some of the European producers of high fashion goods, which will only benefit, again, the industry. Some of the things we need to look at as far as the technical considerations of TPAs, FTAs, I want to dwell on this for a second, is that transparent customs treatment is part of the agreement. But as far as determining the eligibility of a good, it's usually backed up by a certificate of origin. But there's no certificate document form that's been mandated. And the format of the GSP, Generalized System of Preferences, Form A, seems the most acceptable because it's been used by member nations of both the GATT and the WTO. As a side note, Customs and Border Protection here in the U.S. no longer mandates presentation of an original GSP Form A, so they don't dictate what kind of a certificate of origin you should provide. We're assuming that basically EU model is going to be followed for U.S. goods seeking duty-free entry into Panama or Colombia. And the way this document usually looks, it's got a background of a shade of green, not specifically specified. Superimposed on that background is what's called a guilloche. It's an ornamentation imitating braided or interlaced ribbons. I've got a sample of this variant of a document from the old CBTPA certificate. If you notice, it's yellowish in tint, but it gives the same indication of what we're talking about as far as the documentation that may be required. But it may not be just a certificate of origin that will essentially make your good eligible for duty-free entry into Panama or Colombia, because of what may happen in that certificate of origin of goods coming out of the United States. May have component parts from downstream suppliers, and exporters may have to verify the origin via affidavits by U.S. producers of any component parts that are incorporated into the final good, just as customs in the United States requires those sorts of verifications for goods coming into the country. And that basically is my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Thank you very much, John. And now we'll open the queue for voice questions. If you have a voice question, please press *1, and thank you very much for your written questions. But if you have a voice question, please press *1. So while we're waiting for voice questions, we'll go to some of the written questions that are in our queue. I'm going to start with the question here from Sarah, looks like Sarah Bernier. Does water sanitation projects get categorized in a $26 billion infrastructure funding in Colombia?
No, but it's an excellent question because it actually is a big market in Colombia. The infrastructure is pretty much roads, but it also goes to airport modernization, as well as port modernization and development and bridges. However, water treatment in general is a big concern here in Colombia. They have two coasts, and the Caribbean coast is all about tourism. And in fact, the U.S. Trade Development Agency funded money to go into a feasibility study for a water treatment plant in Cartagena. So if this company in particular is interested, I'm happy to talk to you more about opportunities in wastewater treatment. And in fact, we have a market research report that we just updated on this market.
Okay, great. Anyone else have anything to add? Okay, next question here is from Stefan Milan. Their company, Millen Associates, is working with a high-tech, green, eco-friendly agricultural products geared towards increasing crop yields, cut flowers, fruits and vegetable preservation. We are finding that entry of our products into Colombia are severely restricted by the requirements of ICA in terms of cost and bureaucracy. Can someone, for example, our U.S. ambassador, voice these concerns? Colombia could benefit from these products.
Yeah, obviously a big market here, agricultural exports, although complementary to the U.S., flowers, coffee, fruits, which is exactly the opposite of what the U.S. exports to Colombia is good, and obviously the machinery and these green technologies. We do have an agricultural attaché, Joe Lopez, at the U.S. Embassy here in Bogota, and he would be, I would say, the first stop before the ambassador, because he can provide some more insight in the exact programs that Colombia has implemented, whether these will be liberalized under the free trade agreement. So again, it might take me a second to find his email address. Better yet, if you can provide through the host of this webinar your contact information, I will put you in touch with Joe Lopez, and you can talk to him directly about this issue.
Great, thank you. I know everyone has a lot of questions about the PowerPoint presentation slides. Once again, if you'd like to download them, on the upper right-hand side of your computer are just 3 of the PowerPoint presentation slides. The Exxon Bank presentation slide looks like we can get to you, so we will get to that later. But all the rest of the PowerPoint presentation slides you can find by going to that icon on the right-hand side, putting your mouse's cursor over the 3 pieces of paper, and just downloading them either to a folder or to your desktop. So I hope that answers everyone's question. Next question here looks like it's from Gerardo Frias. We want to know which country is better to develop a third-party warehouse, Colombia or Panama? And this person's in Mexico. Gerardo Frias.
This is Dan speaking from Panama. I think when it comes to third-party logistics and staging or consolidating regionalized inventory, the Atlantic mouth of the Panama Canal is a city known as Colón, and it's got the world's second largest free trade zone. And if you go to export.gov/Panama, we've got some content on how advantageous that is for anybody in the consumer retail space. Last year, they moved about $29 billion in and out of that Colón free trade zone. So there are all kinds of third-party logistics providers already there, ranging from the low-end kind of stuff that you'd see, let's say, in a Kmart, all the way up to stuff you'd see in a Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, as well as things like pharmaceuticals, which imply a high degree of security, IPR, intellectual property concerns, and cold chain expiration concerns. All those are met. Pfizer alone, for instance, moved $3 billion, that's billion with a B, through the Colón free zone last year. And if you think about it in terms of staging inventory, it's inherently an efficient model because it's at the mouth, as I mentioned, of the Panama Canal on the Atlantic side. And so looking north, you have all of Central America, and those are small economies. And then looking east, you have the entire Caribbean, which, of course, is a collection of islands. So you don't want to replicate inventory in all those places. You want to consolidate it for regional distribution. And increasingly what we're seeing is they're taking that model, which has already reached critical mass, and they're extending it as far as Brazil, which would have really surprised me because Brazil, I would have thought, would have justified its own inventory model. So it's an area that's growing rapidly, and I'd certainly welcome you coming down and taking a look.
Thank you, Dan. And from Gerardo, again, another question is that he distributes hazmat products. Do you know if there are any benefits in tariffs for this kind of product in both Colombia and Panama?
I don't have the HS code encyclopedia in my head, I'm afraid. So that's Cameron mentioned the FTA tariff tool, and that's got a nice lookup where you'd say you'd really type in the details of a material keyword search. HS codes will pop up. You confirm that's the HS code, and then you run it through the ringer to see what the duties are now, potentially, and what they would be under FTA.
Great. Well, that's all the written questions I have right now. Let's go to the operator to handle any voice questions.
And there are no questions on the phone line.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. We'll go back to the written queue and see, or the queue to see if we have any more written questions. Looks like a couple came in. Okay. Question here from Desi Jordanoff. Although there is no direct link between the free trade agreements and the foreign direct investment in the U.S., do you see any benefits to the dynamic increase in FDI from Colombia and Panama in the U.S. and in what industries?
Yeah, I'll start with Colombia. We're seeing more Colombian companies investing in the United States. In fact, Colombia has, I forget the exact number, but it's like the 4th largest cement manufacturer in the United States through investments. One of its largest dairy companies, Alpina, has invested heavily in the northeast of the United States. And we're seeing more and more of this. So obviously, the benefit is the creation of U.S. jobs. The United States has been very active through its Select USA program, ongoing to attract foreign direct investment to the United States. The Commercial Service is very active in terms of promoting foreign direct investment into the United States. We work with all the states to do this. And, of course, the goal is really to increase employment. So it's got huge advantages. And I think that the FTA will just increase the visibility of the United States in the eyes of Colombian investors. Dan, anything to add?
This is Dan for Panama. One thing I would say is that an FTA, I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth, I think, saying again, it's kind of like a good housekeeping seal of approval. all countries want to attract more foreign direct investment, and they go out and they do the road shows and they try to get companies to invest. And that is good for U.S. exporters. Why? Because we see exports follow foreign direct investment. I mean, that's a given. It's clear causal effect. But it's just one in a quiver of tools. For instance, in CAFTA, Guatemala and Honduras have had some other problems, for instance, security, and as a result, they may not have seen as much foreign direct investment in the past years. So it's just one of a number of tools, like a stable political and economic environment, a relatively safe environment, that companies look at when they're deciding in which country to invest. Panama certainly very aggressively marketed FTA as a good housekeeping seal of approval, but really they've been able to attract a lot of foreign direct investment because of those other attributes that I mentioned.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cameron, and thanks, Dan. I believe that's all the written questions we have. One last time.
I do have questions on the phone line now.
Okay, great.
Thank you. First one is from Esteban. Your line is open.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Esteban Milan with Milan & Associates. We basically created a small Colombo-American company to basically pursue these new opportunities. We did it in 2009 when the FTA with Colombia was still, being considered and so forth. But anyway, and we're very excited. A lot of our customers are getting or will begin to get in 2013 a 15% break in the imports of some of the high-tech materials. Following up this FTA, there is something that is a concern to us, which is, for example, as one of your presenters mentioned, Colombia has increased their level standards significantly. So, meaning that if they have, electrical components and so forth that they manufacture there or they import there, they're subjected to the UL Underwriters Laboratory standards, which is something fantastic. And then that happens across the industries. However, they went a little bit too far because they created, let's say, for the high-temperature wiring cables that we export to Colombia, we have sold to Reficar, which is a portion, is one of the Ecopetrol arms, which is the refinery in Cartagena. But then they created an agency that is called RETI, which is R-E-T-I, which is basically some sort of a certification agency for products, electrical products. But here's the problem is that, the United States has one of the highest standards, highly recognized worldwide, and we have an UL standard for our wiring cable, and then when we send them to Colombia, they have to be subjected to this RETI test. Problem is that these cables that we're sending down there are cables that are not manufactured in Colombia nor anywhere else in South America that we know of, because they're very specialized products. However, they want to test them and approve them even though they don't even know what kind of products they are. So, to go straight to the point, we will be very interested in having Colombia grandfather the U.S. standards for certain products that are, above and beyond what the standards are, let's say in Colombia or Panama. I mean, we're not trying to be obnoxious or pretend that we are the best, but, definitely these products credit this sort of certification and they can pass any test. However, because of that, they discourage, the approval or slows down the approval and the dispatch and increases significantly the cost. It's just like an additional tax. It's a hidden tax that we're being faced with. The same thing happens with the agrochemicals compounds. We have to deal with the ICA, which is the Instituto Colombiano de Agricultura, and where they're, here our products are approved by the EPA and the FDA. Down there, they want to have some sort of an approval certification that is many times, like 3 times what we pay for a certificate here in the United States. So that's our concern. It's something that, I don't know how to go about it. It seems like, it's a a larger issue, but nevertheless is a hidden tax that we're being faced with that, our Colombian competitors are not faced with. And I just wanted to put that out there.
John Hyatt here, Irvin Brown Company. What you've mentioned is basically should be covered in the dispute resolution sections of the agreements, which allow basically equal treatment of products. And I think under dispute resolution, these kind of issues as far as additional testing or, going through some other agency and paying additional fees for something that's accepted as, good in the United States under UL or under EPA, I think that's where the issue should be in the dispute resolution process. But again, until the agreement is actually in force, I'm not sure whether we can go through this. Basically, we feel that by the end of the first quarter this year, both of the agreements would be in place, and then those kinds of issues can be addressed.
I appreciate your answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is Cameron Worker. I would add that, big difference between a national standard and something company specific. So I'm unclear as to whether in the first instance you talked about was RefiCar specific or it was a Colombian national standard. So that would be, if it's RefiCar specific, there's nothing the free trade agreement can do about that because that'd be an individual company's.
No, actually RefiCar waived that because they're part of the government. Well, at that time they were. It's a Colombian national certificate, and we didn't have to deal with that with RefiCar. We don't have problems with these agencies because they can waive their own rules. However, when we go to distributors and we want to reach out to, let's say, I'm thinking about the iron and steel mills.
Well, let me just stop you there. I know that this is getting maybe a little too specific for everybody else in the call,
yes.
But I would advise that you can certainly reach out to the United States Trade Representative, and if there are national standards that you think are that are becoming barriers to trade, then you can raise that with them, and they can address it in the technical implementation phase, and maybe avoid a problem even before it's implemented. They are the U.S. government agency that is responsible for negotiating the implementation, and these are the types of issues that they are interested in hearing about so they can address them before it's too late.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Sure.
And we have a question from Carlos. Your line is open.
Yes. Hello, my name is Carlos Suarez, and I'm with Global Bass Enterprises. And my question is, under the FTA, are we going to be able to export used vehicles into Colombia and Panama?
It depends. This is Cameron in Colombia. It will depend on the type of vehicle. You're talking about consumer passenger vehicle, heavy trucks, buses, what kind of vehicles?
Yeah, just regular four-door vehicles and commercial vehicles used, as well as motorcycles.
This is Dan for Panama. The devil's always in the details with this kind of stuff, and the content of origin was discussed earlier, and that still applies. For instance, you can't, bring in a car from Korea and have it be 2 months old and then re-export and expect to have FTA apply. So there's a bit of a trick there. But in general, the used cars market, at least for Panama, is already pretty robust. There are a decent number of imports of used vehicles as well as new vehicles. So no reason to suspect that wouldn't continue under FTA.
Yeah, we've seen that ourselves. John Hyatt here. We've handled a number of exports of used vehicles to Panama on a weekly basis. So it is a thriving market, I agree.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
There are no other calls or questions on the line.
Okay. We do have another good question here from Aaron Bart. This will be our last question because I know we're going a little bit over time. Being the manufacturer of a medical product, are there specific regulatory requirements or restrictions in your respective countries different or above and beyond U.S. requirements? And are there any other specific medical product requirements that you feel are important to mention?
This is Dan in Panama, and I hate to keep on saying this, but the devil's in the details. There are regulations here in Panama that even apply not just to public purchases of medical equipment, but also apply to private hospitals and the disposal of medical waste, for instance. And those are regulations that we don't even necessarily agree with, and we're actually working actively to see that they don't prohibit entrant of U.S. competitors in the medical equipment space. So the bottom line is that you probably should reach out to Cameron and to me separately so that we can get some more detail on the product that you'd like to sell here, and we can find out more for you.
One other point I should make, John Hyatt here, if this is an FDA medical device, the procedure for getting a medical device approved by FDA is very onerous. So if it is approved by FDA, it should be a simple matter to go into that country.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Everyone, I'm afraid that is all the time we have. Remember, for those questions we didn't answer, you can please email us. You can email me, linda.abrazizi@trade.gov. I can distribute it to our speakers. Also, please check out the U.S. Commercial Services website at www.export.gov for more upcoming events and webinars. Thank you to Dan, Cameron, David, Kate, and John for your excellent presentation. And thanks again to all of our participants for joining in on this webinar. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
This concludes today's conference. You may disconnect at this time. Thank you.